August 1943. A grey troop transport ship cut through the Atlantic waters, its deck crowded with weary men in faded German uniforms. They were soldiers of the Reich, no longer warriors, but prisoners, captives of a war they had believed would never touch their homeland. For weeks, they had crossed an ocean in silence, unsure of what awaited them on the far shore, the United States. To most of these men, the name meant little more than a vague picture painted by propaganda, an industrial giant full of crude, materialistic people, a land of chaos, poverty, and crime. At least that's what they had been told. Now, as the shoreline of New York Harbor came into view, their hearts beat with a mixture of dread and defiance. They expected jeers. They expected spit, hatred, maybe even violence. After all, these were the men who had bombed London, who had fought in North Africa, who had stared down American soldiers in Tunisia. Why would their captors show mercy? But when they disembarked, something extraordinary happened. Instead of chaos, they saw order. Instead of hatred, they found silence, stern, yes, but strangely dignified. The guards who lined their path were alert, rifles at the ready, but they did not curse or strike. They simply directed the prisoners forward with calm, efficient authority. It was not what the Germans had braced for. And then there was the city itself. The towering skyline of Manhattan shimmered in the summer light. Bridges arched across the water, dotted with endless streams of cars and trucks. On the docks, cranes swung heavy cargo with mechanical precision, loading and unloading without pause. Everywhere there was motion, commerce, production, life. For men who had been told that America was weak, divided, decadent, this sight was nothing short of bewildering. When they boarded trains bound for prison camps across the American heartland, the astonishment only deepened. From the windows, they saw farms stretching to the horizon, fields rich with corn and wheat. Cattle herds grazed, railroads thundered, and towns bustled with shops and children at play. This was wartime America, yet where were the ruins? Where was the hunger? These men had left behind cities scarred by bombings, families scraping for coal, rations that grew thinner each month. And here, halfway across the world, their enemies seemed to live untouched, as if the war barely grazed them. The German officers tried to mask their unease, whispering warnings not to be deceived. Surely this was all a facade, a carefully arranged illusion to break their spirits. Yet every mile of countryside, every factory town that rolled past their train windows told a different story. America was not collapsing under the weight of war. It was thriving. When the trains finally stopped and the prisoners were marched through camp gates, they noticed something else that unsettled them. The camps themselves were organized, almost methodical. Wooden barracks, clean mess halls, medical facilities, even recreation fields. The food they were given was plain but plentiful: bread, meat, potatoes, fresh vegetables. It was more than many of their families back home were receiving. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. Could this truly be the enemy they had been told was decadent and weak? A nation that not only fed its soldiers, but even fed its captives better than Germany fed its own citizens. That night, as they lay on bunks inside freshly built barracks, the weight of the contradiction pressed down on them. They had marched into the war believing Germany was destined to dominate, its strength unmatched. Yet already, in these first bewildering hours on American soil, a new and troubling question gnawed at their certainty. If this was how the enemy treated prisoners, if this was how the enemy lived in the midst of global war, then what kind of power were they truly up against? And then they were taken to a place that shattered everything they thought they knew about the world. Autumn 1943, while German prisoners were stepping onto American soil, their families back home were enduring a very different reality. In Germany, war had seeped into every corner of daily life. Food was no longer a matter of choice, but of ration cards, thin booklets that determined how much bread, meat, or sugar a person could claim in a week. And even then, the allotments shrank with every passing month. Real coffee had vanished long ago, replaced by a bitter substitute brewed from roasted acorns or chicory root. Butter was rare, chocolate a forgotten luxury. Housewives stood in long lines, clutching ration coupons. never sure if the shelves would still hold anything by the time they reached the front. The skies above their cities brought no comfort either. British and American bombers filled the night with fire. Sirens wailed, searchlights swept across the heavens, and families huddled in basements as the earth trembled. In Hamburg, in Cologne, in Berlin, whole neighborhoods vanished in nights of smoke and ash. Children emerged from shelters to find streets reduced to rubble and homes leveled into dust. Yet the newspapers told a different story. The Reich's propaganda machine roared louder than ever, promising final victory, speaking of wonder weapons, assuring the people that hardship was temporary. Posters showed smiling families, farmers with overflowing baskets, soldiers marching proudly toward triumph. But the gap between words and reality grew wider by the day. People whispered about their neighbors, afraid of being overheard. Fear of the Gestapo, silent, unseen, always listening, was part of every household. For the soldiers now in American captivity, this had been their normal. Shortages were not unusual. Substitutes were ordinary. To them, dimmed lights, blacked-out windows, and bomb shelters were just facts of existence. They had been told that everyone in the world was suffering like this, that every nation at war faced the same hunger, the same deprivation, the same sacrifices, and perhaps in some ways they believed it. The Reich had convinced them that the enemy was worse off, that the Americans were fractured, materialistic, unable to endure a long war. That if Germany only held firm, the enemy would collapse first. But as they rode trains through the American countryside, those illusions began to unravel. They saw farmlands bursting with harvests, locomotives pulling endless cars of coal and steel. They saw towns whose streets glowed brightly at night, whose shops were full of goods. Even in captivity, they were handed more meat, bread, and vegetables than their own families back home could dream of. The contrast was brutal. Their homelands staggered under shortages and fear, while across the ocean their enemy lived as if untouched by war. For German prisoners, it was like staring into a mirror that reflected not weakness but abundance. Not scarcity but plenty, and the greatest shock was still to come, because across the Atlantic they would soon see a version of modern life that felt almost like science fiction. By the time the German prisoners arrived at their destinations, many were bracing for punishment. They expected hunger, filth, maybe even brutality. After all, hadn't their leaders told them that the Americans were barbarians? Instead, the gates opened to something they never could have imagined. Prisoner of war camps in the United States were not dungeons of suffering. They were orderly compounds, built with military precision, but run with an unexpected degree of humanity. The United States, unlike many nations at war, adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention. That meant prisoners were entitled to shelter, clothing, medical care, and food equal to what American soldiers themselves received. When the German captives lined up for their first meals, they blinked in disbelief. Plates piled with bread, meat, potatoes, and vegetables were handed out without hesitation. Coffee, real coffee, steamed in tin cups. For men accustomed to thin soups and ersatz substitutes back home, it felt almost impossible. Some even tucked food away, certain that such abundance would not last. But it did. Meal after meal, week after week, the rations remained steady. Beyond the mess halls, there were barracks, simple but clean. Wooden bunks, blankets, stoves for the winter, medical stations staffed by doctors, and most astonishing of all, libraries stocked with German and English books. The captives could read Goethe, Schiller, or even American novels translated into their own language. The guards enforced discipline, yes, but not cruelty. There were rules, roll calls, work details, curfews. Yet within those boundaries, life carried on in ways the prisoners had thought impossible in captivity. Sports fields were laid out. Soccer matches erupted on sunny afternoons, with teams of prisoners shouting and laughing like boys again. Some camps even built orchestras, prisoners playing violins, accordions, or brass instruments they had requested through the Red Cross. And then there was work. Many POWs were assigned to farms, factories, or construction crews, always under guard, but for fair wages paid in camp currency. With those earnings, they could buy small comforts at canteens: soap, cigarettes, stationery, even candy. Letters flowed back and forth across the Atlantic, censored but delivered, allowing men to write to their wives, their parents, their children. The more they settled into camp life, the more surreal it became. Captivity in America did not mean starvation. It did not mean darkness or despair. In some strange way, it meant a return to normalcy, something most of them had not known in years. At night, in their bunks, the men whispered about the contradiction. Why were their enemies treating them this way? Why would a nation at war waste food, time, and resources on men who had once fired bullets at them? Was it arrogance, mercy? Or was it proof of a kind of strength the Reich had never admitted existed? One prisoner later recalled that for the first time, he began to see the United States not as a caricature, but as a living, breathing force. A country so confident in its power that it did not need cruelty to demonstrate control. Yet, as surprising as camp life was, the greatest shocks came when the prisoners were taken outside the barbed wire. Because beyond those fences, they would witness an America that defied everything they thought they knew about the modern world, but nothing inside the camps compared to what they witnessed when taken beyond the barbed wire. Spring 1944. The German prisoners of war had grown accustomed to the rhythm of camp life, the orderly roll calls, the steady meals, the strange comforts of books and sport. Yet for a select few, a new experience awaited, one that would blur the line between captivity and disbelief, assigned to work details on American farms, or in factories that churned out the engines of war. They climbed into trucks and trains, expecting backbreaking labor under watchful eyes. Instead, they found a landscape that seemed almost unreal. As their vehicles rattled down the roads of the Midwest, the prisoners peered through windows and saw towns that contradicted every story they had ever been told. Streets were clean, almost immaculate, with neat rows of brick buildings and sidewalks swept free of debris. Neon signs flickered above shop doors, advertising clothes, household goods, and food, a dazzling array of products they had been told were impossible to obtain in a nation at war. Shops overflowed with stock. Canned goods, fresh produce, sweets, and baked breads lined the shelves. There were toys for children, radios for families, even bicycles gleaming under the morning sun. For men who had endured shortages of sugar, coffee, and even basic staples, it was disorienting. The propaganda had painted Americans as desperate, struggling, and unprepared. Yet here was evidence to the contrary, a civilization not just surviving war, but thriving in its midst. The prisoners noticed the people too. Men in suits strolled past women carrying baskets full of goods. Children laughed and ran along the streets. Factory workers emerged at shift's end, chatting and smiling, a stark contrast to the haggard, anxious faces of Germans back home. There were no air raid sirens wailing in the distance, no ration lines snaking endlessly, no constant fear of Gestapo spies in the crowd. Life went on, ordinary, vibrant, almost defiant in its continuity. Even the farms they were sent to were a revelation. Fields stretched to the horizon, heavy with wheat, corn, and soy. Tractors and machinery moved with precision, planting and harvesting as if time itself had been mastered. The men worked under watch, yes, but the rhythm of productivity was mesmerizing. There was pride in the labor, a sense of purpose that seemed as natural as breathing. Some prisoners whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with awe. This cannot be real," one said quietly, staring at a fruit-laden orchard. Another shook his head at the neat rows of milk cows grazing in sunlit pastures. The reality they had known. The Reich at war, rationing, bombings. Fear clashed violently with the vision of this thriving land. Yet all of these glimpses, as startling as they were only the prelude to a revelation that would redefine their understanding of American life. Because while towns could be tidy and farms productive, the true measure of abundance lay in a place that Americans took for granted: a place where the ordinary became extraordinary. And so, as the trucks rolled toward their next work assignment, the prisoners would come face to face with a scene that made their training, their expectations, and even their propaganda-laden minds fail entirely. Yet the greatest shock awaited them in a place Americans considered ordinary, the supermarket. July 1944. A small convoy of POW trucks rumbled down a country road, winding past farms and quiet towns. The German prisoners, still marveling at the clean streets and well-stocked shops, had no idea that the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that would truly shake their understanding of the world, was about to arrive. The truck came to a halt outside a low, unassuming building with glass doors and large windows. Inside, fluorescent lights gleamed, illuminating rows upon rows of goods. The prisoners were herded in, some hesitant, some wide-eyed, but all utterly unprepared for what they were about to witness. They stepped into a space that defied every wartime expectation. Endless aisles stretched in perfect order, stacked with tins, bottles, and boxes of every imaginable food. Fresh fruits, some from as far away as California or Florida, glistened as though sunlight itself had been captured and stored in crates. Apples and oranges, bananas and grapes, all out of season, all abundant. Cans of soup, vegetables and beans lined shelves in neat uniform rows. Labels boasted brands the prisoners had never heard of. Colorful packaging that seemed more like advertising art than simple food containers. The air smelled faintly of bread and sugar, of coffee and fruit. It was a scent of plenty, of comfort, of a life unshackled from the daily terror of hunger. Some prisoners tentatively picked up items, turning them over in their hands, as if confirming that they were real. Could this really be for sale? Could ordinary families simply walk in and buy these treasures while soldiers fought and died across the ocean? Clerks in crisp uniforms moved among the aisles, polite, efficient, and unhurried. They smiled and answered questions, bagged items carefully, and treated each customer with the same calm dignity that the POWs had first noticed when stepping off the ships months earlier. There was no tension, no fear, no sense that a city or a nation was teetering on the edge of collapse. Here was normal life, flourishing amid a world at war. The prisoners whispered among themselves, their voices low and incredulous. They compared what they saw to the bread lines and ration cards back home. They remembered ersatz coffee, stale rolls, and empty shelves. And now, in this small building, they were confronted with a reality so staggering that some could hardly believe their eyes. For many, it was more than just abundance. It was a kind of quiet power. The Reich had tanks, planes, and weapons designed to dominate battlefields. Yet here was a weapon of a different sort: economic might, industrial efficiency, and societal organization so robust that ordinary Americans could enjoy luxury while waging total war. Food for them was not scarcity, it was strength. One prisoner later recounted that he felt a strange mix of awe and dread. He could see how morale could be preserved, how communities could remain resilient, how a nation could endure and even thrive when every other society around it buckled under the pressure of conflict. It was a demonstration not of military genius, but of infrastructure, logistics, and the sheer will to maintain life itself. As they moved through the aisles, the conversation grew urgent, whispered but persistent. The men began to question everything they had been told about the war, about the enemy, about the inevitable triumph of the Reich. If Americans could live like this in wartime, enjoying abundance, comfort, and security, while still sending armies abroad, then what chance did their homeland truly have? The idea circulated slowly at first, like smoke in a room, then spread like wildfire among the prisoners. Eyes met, nods were exchanged, murmurs carried along the shelves of food. If America could live like this, could Germany really win? And that question would linger in their minds, echoing long after they left the fluorescent-lit aisles, and whispers spread among the POWs. If America could live like this in wartime, what chance did the Reich truly have? Summer 1944. The German prisoners had walked the aisles of supermarkets, stared at the overflowing produce, and whispered in disbelief. Yet even as their minds tried to grasp the sheer volume of food and goods, they were only seeing the surface of a much deeper reality, a reality built not on chance, but on an industrial miracle that Germany could scarcely imagine. America, unlike the war-torn cities of Europe, had a network of production and logistics that operated with astonishing precision. Factories roared with life, churning out everything from canned goods to tanks with a rhythm almost musical in its consistency. Assembly lines moved with mechanical perfection, thousands of workers performing specialized tasks, each motion practiced, timed, and synchronized to a degree that transformed raw materials into finished products faster than any European nation could match. Railroads carried these goods across vast distances. Trains clattered through the night, connecting farms, factories, and ports in a network that seemed infinite. Perishable items, fresh produce, and meats reached cities hundreds of miles from the source with remarkable speed, all coordinated by planners who treated logistics not as an afterthought, but as the backbone of national survival. The prisoners had passed by these same rail lines, noting the freight cars piled high with commodities, yet they could not fully comprehend the orchestration behind it. American agriculture was equally astounding. Millions of acres were cultivated, with mechanized efficiency. Tractors, harvesters, and automated irrigation systems turned the soil into a conveyor belt of food. Farmers coordinated with rail networks, warehouses, and distribution centers so that production never halted. Even the labor of POWs contributed to this system, a minor but symbolic role in a vast machine that had no equal in Europe. Meanwhile, Germany struggled. Cities were crumbling under bombardment, trains were delayed or destroyed, and fields lay fallow due to fuel shortages or conscripted labor. Rationing dictated every meal. Ersatz ingredients replaced staples, and every shipment of supplies was contested by front lines, blockades, and a collapsing infrastructure. The Reich could not feed its own people adequately, much less supply its allies or occupied territories with the goods needed to sustain morale. For the POWs, the contrast was more than shocking. It was disorienting. Their training had taught them to view America as an inferior adversary, one that would collapse under the weight of prolonged conflict. Yet here was proof to the contrary. Not only did the US feed its soldiers and its citizens, but it also supplied allies across the globe, from the frozen plains of Russia to the battlefields of North Africa. This abundance was not a fluke. It was a testament to planning, ingenuity, and an almost industrial perfection of resource management. One officer, observing the trucks loaded with goods bound for distant ports, later wrote that he realized the Americans had turned infrastructure into a weapon more powerful than any artillery. They do not need to strike with bombs, he noted. They sustain life itself, and in that lies their true strength. And that was where the most insidious effect lay, not in steel or bullets, but in the mind. The German soldiers had been raised to equate strength with scarcity, to believe that deprivation forged resilience, that hunger hardened men for combat. Yet America had proven the opposite. Abundance could coexist with war, and stability could be maintained even in the face of global conflict. It was not just economic, it was psychological. And this realization began to break something deep inside. The soldiers of the Reich, a quiet erosion of certainty that would haunt them far beyond the fields, the factories, and the supermarket aisles they had once marveled at. But this abundance wasn't just economic, it was psychological, and it broke something deep inside the Reich's soldiers. Late summer, 1944. The German prisoners had settled into the rhythm of camp life, taken in the orderly towns, worked on sprawling farms, and wandered through supermarkets that glowed with abundance. With each passing day, the illusion of the enemy they had been trained to hate began to crumble. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as weak, decadent, and morally corrupt. Americans were portrayed as soft, indulgent, and incapable of enduring the sacrifices of war. Soldiers were told their enemy lacked discipline, that their homes were starving, and that the entire nation teetered on the brink of collapse. The Reich demanded loyalty, obedience, and belief in this narrative. And for many young men, it had been accepted as fact without question. But in the fields of Iowa, the factories of Pennsylvania, and the glowing streets of small towns, that narrative dissolved. The prisoners saw men and women who worked long hours, whose hands bore calluses, and whose brows were lined with effort. Families managed households with care, children attended school while parents labored, and communities thrived with a sense of cohesion that the Reich claimed was impossible outside authoritarian control. In the fields, POWs worked alongside Americans, or observed from a distance, as farmers tended to crops that would feed not only their families, but soldiers across the world. There was no scarcity here, only abundance. Machinery hummed in harmony with human labor, producing more than the country could consume. Even in wartime, life did not grind to a halt. The very sight of this productivity struck at the core of what they had been taught, that democracy was inefficient, that freedom led to chaos, that strength could only come from fear and force. Families in towns welcomed the soldiers with cautious civility. Children waved from porches, mothers greeted the prisoners with polite nods, and shopkeepers continued their business without the desperation or panic that had become commonplace in Germany. There were no lines of starving citizens, no black markets clawing at the scraps of society, no constant air of surveillance and suspicion. Life continued and thrived without dictatorship. Even leisure existed. Sports fields, cinemas, libraries, and music halls offered recreation for Americans at home and for the prisoners in camps. It was a society that valued order, efficiency, and freedom, not through coercion, but through shared responsibility and ingenuity. The German soldiers had been taught to view comfort as weakness, but here was proof that strength could coexist with abundance and liberty. The effect on the prisoners was profound and unsettling. They had believed in the inevitability of the Reich's triumph, in the moral and intellectual superiority of their nation. And yet, as they moved through this world, so vibrant, so stable, so self-sufficient, their certainty wavered. The enemy they had been trained to fear appeared not only formidable, but resilient in ways propaganda had never described. Conversations in the mess halls and barracks grew tense, quiet, charged with a dangerous curiosity. Questions that would have been unthinkable months earlier were now whispered openly. Comparisons were made, observations shared. Every time they returned to their bunks, every time they saw a well-stocked store or a thriving community, the dissonance deepened. And with each passing day, the prisoners began to ask themselves a dangerous question: had they been fighting for a doomed cause? Autumn 1944. The camps were quiet after roll call, the wind rustling through the trees outside, carrying the faint scent of freshly turned soil from nearby farms. Inside the barracks, German prisoners sat at wooden tables or on their bunks, scratching pens. Across paper, recording thoughts they could scarcely voice aloud. Letters home had always been a lifeline, censored, carefully monitored, yet a bridge to families they feared for and missed desperately. Now, however, these letters became something more. Some prisoners risked subtle truth in their words, describing the bewildering abundance they had witnessed. They wrote of farms that produced more than they could eat, of streets that glowed with commerce, of stores overflowing with goods even as war raged abroad. Their families back home could scarcely believe the accounts. Diaries, too, became a refuge. Hidden in bunks, tucked under mattresses, men detailed every astonishing observation. apples shipped from states they had never heard of, milk delivered daily to kitchens, bread baked fresh and in plentiful supply. They noted the efficiency of production, the precision of rail networks, the thriving communities that seemed untouched by the global conflict. With every entry, a quiet revolution unfolded in their minds. Some soldiers recorded the most terrifying realization of all. Their entire belief system was faltering. For years, they had been taught that Germany was destined to dominate, that their sacrifices were noble, that the Reich's enemies would crumble under the strain of war. Yet here, in letters and diaries, they documented proof to the contrary. America was not just surviving, it was thriving. Its people were fed, its cities functioning, its industries producing with unstoppable momentum. The propaganda they had been fed, the tales of enemy desperation, the warnings of decadent collapse, they were false. The prisoners often read their notes to one another in hushed voices, sharing disbelief and wonder. "How is this possible?" one wrote, then crossed it out, unsure if admitting it aloud was safe. Another recorded, "I cannot reconcile what I have seen with what I was taught." The truth is stronger than any doctrine. For many, the psychological impact was profound. The initial shock of seeing supermarkets, factories, and productive farms had only scratched the surface. It was in these quiet moments, writing in journals, or whispering to friends, that the weight of understanding settled. The Reich, they realized, was not facing a weak adversary. It was confronting a nation whose very infrastructure, industry, and ingenuity were a weapon more formidable than any tank or plane. Yet even as doubts grew, so did fear. To admit that Hitler's promises were hollow, to acknowledge the efficiency and strength of the enemy was dangerous. If ever discovered, it could mean punishment. And so, most wrote with careful phrasing, careful omissions, balancing truth with caution. But the message beneath the words was unmistakable. Belief was eroding. Certainty was crumbling. These silent realizations, recorded meticulously, passed, discreetly, internalized profoundly, marked a turning point for many POWs. The war they had believed in, the cause they had served, no longer appeared inevitable or righteous. The truth of American abundance, efficiency, and resilience had begun to penetrate their minds in ways no bombardment or propaganda could. And yet, as powerful as these personal reckonings were, they hinted at something even larger. If America's supermarkets could change the mind of a soldier, if simple abundance could shatter conviction, what would they mean for the future of the war itself? Winter, 1944. Snow lay thick on the grounds of POW camps across the American Midwest, a silent blanket covering barracks and fields alike. Inside, the German prisoners had long since acclimated to camp life. They knew the routine: roll call, work details, meals, quiet evenings. But outside the fences, a deeper truth of the American war effort was beginning to crystallize in their minds. The same machinery that filled the supermarkets, the factories, the railroads, the farms, was also building the instruments of war, on an industrial scale that the Reich could barely comprehend. Assembly lines once marveled at for efficiency now revealed their deadly purpose. Plants that produced flour and canned goods simultaneously churned out B-29 bombers, Liberty ships, and Sherman tanks. Every rivet, every weld, every crate of food was part of a network designed to sustain life and fight battles across the globe. Prisoners who had worked in farms and factories began to connect the dots. Trucks that delivered milk and vegetables in one state also carried steel, engines, and munitions to distant ports. Rail lines that transported fruit crates to supermarkets doubled as arteries feeding armies abroad. The American economy was a war machine in itself, invisible yet omnipresent, converting abundance into power, normalcy into unstoppable might. Some POWs, with a mixture of awe and apprehension, realized that their experience in supermarkets, libraries, and sports fields was not separate from the war. It was directly connected. The same organizational genius that allowed Americans to stock grocery shelves, while under global threat, allowed them to project force thousands of miles away. Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines faster than the Germans could sink them. Bombers took flight from hidden airfields, their payloads fueled by oil and logistics meticulously calculated far from the front lines. Tanks rumbled across training grounds, engines humming in precise synchronization with every other element of the war machine. The prisoners whispered in barracks, connecting abundance to strategy. The supermarkets, they began to understand, were more than a symbol of plenty. They were a window into the strength of a nation whose foundation was resilience, innovation, and sheer productivity. While the Reich struggled to maintain rations and transport supplies under constant bombardment, the United States maintained both morale and machinery, feeding its people while equipping armies that could fight on multiple continents simultaneously. And yet, the psychological impact was just as potent as the industrial one. Soldiers who had seen bombed-out streets in Hamburg or Berlin could not reconcile it with their experiences in American towns. They had come to fear defeat at the hands of a supposedly decadent enemy, only to discover that the enemy thrived under conditions Germany could not match. The lesson was unavoidable. Abundance and efficiency were weapons of their own kind, more formidable than any artillery barrage. It was not simply numbers on a ledger or tons of steel. It was proof that a nation could endure, innovate, and sustain itself in a way that Germany could not replicate. The POWs had witnessed it firsthand: orderly towns, thriving farms, stocked supermarkets, and a logistical network that connected every corner of the country. Each realization chipped away at the ideological certainty that had propelled them to war, revealing a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat. And when the Reich finally fell, the POWs would return home, carrying memories that would reshape post-war Germany. The sights, the sounds, the simple, astonishing normalcy of American life, supermarkets brimming with food, factories humming with life, railroads moving with unerring precision, would linger in their minds. These memories were not just souvenirs of captivity, they were lessons in resilience, organization, and the quiet power of a society that could thrive while the world burned. Spring, 1945. The war in Europe was drawing to a close. Across Germany, cities lay in ruins, families struggled to survive, and the Reich had finally collapsed under the weight of its own failures and the unstoppable force of the Allies. For German prisoners held in America, liberation meant more than the end of confinement. It marked the moment they could carry home something far more profound than physical freedom. In the quiet hours after roll call, many reflected on what had defined their captivity: the orderly camps, the work on thriving farms, the libraries, the sports fields, and most of all, the supermarkets. At first, these aisles of abundance had seemed almost surreal, a curiosity to be marveled at and whispered about. Yet over time, they had come to represent far more than food. They embodied freedom, dignity, and the possibility of a society built on trust and efficiency rather than fear and coercion. For men who had grown up under a regime that demanded obedience and rewarded scarcity, the experience was transformative. They had seen firsthand that a nation could maintain order without tyranny, that wealth could coexist with democracy, and that abundance itself could be a kind of power. The supermarkets, stocked with fruits, meats, and goods, flowing effortlessly to every household, were proof that prosperity was not a luxury, it was a foundation. As they returned to Germany, these former POWs carried the lessons quietly, like seeds in the soil of a devastated nation. Some became leaders in reconstruction, advocating for systems that would ensure efficiency, fairness, and abundance. They worked to rebuild towns, revive agriculture, and restore commerce. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that a society could not thrive on fear, propaganda, and ration cards alone. Strength came from preparation, organization, and the capacity to provide for one's people. Letters and diaries carried across the Atlantic now served as informal guides. Stories of thriving American farms, bustling factories, and stocked stores were retold in post-war classrooms, planning meetings, and family kitchens. The memory of supermarkets brimming with choice and plenty became a quiet standard for what Germany might aspire to achieve. Stability, resilience, and the dignity that comes from being able to feed one's people without fear or scarcity. For some former prisoners, the realization was deeply personal. They had entered captivity believing in the inevitability of German triumph and the righteousness of a cause that demanded sacrifice. They returned, having witnessed a different kind of triumph, a society that did not rely on fear, brutality, or conquest, but on infrastructure, logistics, and the quiet power of abundance. The lesson was clear. Prosperity creates strength in a way that oppression never can. And yet, it was not just a lesson in economics or industry. It was a lesson in psychology, in the resilience of human spirit, and in the values that allow a nation to endure through crisis. Americans had built a system that nurtured both productivity and freedom, demonstrating that true power often lies in the unseen mechanisms that sustained life itself, not merely in guns or bombs. In the end, for those German soldiers who had walked the aisles, examined the shelves, and marveled at the flow of goods, the truth was undeniable. The most devastating weapon America had unleashed during the war was not a bomb, a shell, or a battalion. It was the simple, enduring, and astonishing ability to ensure that even in the darkest times, ordinary citizens could live with dignity, choice, and hope. In the end, the most devastating weapon America unleashed wasn't on the battlefield. It was on the shelves of an ordinary store.